Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, and I'm the founder and president of the Pixel Project, and I'm moderating the third Google Hangout session of the fifth. Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. Sorry, guys, we are getting an echo. So, anyway, I am moderating the third Google Hangout session of the fifth International Women's Day edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. So through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 14 award-winning best-selling women writers to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking, as well as help us reveal the first mystery celebrity male role model portrait in our Pixel Reveal campaign. And we'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has a ton of exclusive author goodies a little later in the session. And you can find out more about the Pixel Project and violence against women and how to stop it by visiting www.thepixelproject.net. Now, today we have a very special guest. We are going to have a live discussion and Q&A session with acclaimed horror author Mary SanGiovanni. Ms. SanGiovanni is the author of the Holloway trilogy, the first of which was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award, and the acclaimed Kathy Ryan series. She has been writing fiction for over a decade, has a master's in writing popular fiction from Seton Hill University, and is a member of the Authors Guild and Pen Writers. Now, Mary has also very generously donated a few goodies to our stash of Read for Pixels perks for donors. And these include a 30-minute Skype call with her to chat about books and horror and writing and more. And it's open to individual fans, book clubs, horror clubs, libraries. If you have a horror author hour session, or even schools if you are doing a module on horror. And Mary's happy to chat with you about horror and women in horror and writing horror. And you will also have a chance to become, the second prize is a chance to become a minor character in her next book. Now, Mary's a horror author, and we've been fielding questions about this. Mary's giggling now. Yes, there is a very high chance of dying a horrible death in a very inventive way in Mary's next book. So you have a chance to name that minor character, maybe after yourself, maybe after a friend who's a horror fan, and get sent to the next world in a very inventive manner. Mary's still giggling. And next, the third one is if you are a writer who is working on your WIP right now and you need a fresh pair of eyes, and maybe you're writing dark fantasy, maybe you're writing horror, and you need someone to have a look to see outside your normal beta readers and your normal writing group or writing community. You need someone to have a look at it to see if you're going in the right direction. Now, Mary is offering a written critique via email of 1,000 words from your work in progress. We've had critique prizes and perks in the past, and feedback is it's very useful. So if you are up for it, and if you want to have Mary have a look, we have that up on our fundraising page too, which we will tell you how to get to a little later in the session. Please give generously. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's book to help end violence against women, including this program, Read for Pixels, where we're recording sessions with authors talking about everything from women in books to sexism and misogyny in geek culture, and why we need to stop violence against women worldwide, and the importance of storytelling in kicking off cultural change. And if you are watching this session on YouTube right now, you will also be able to ask Mary questions live. So just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Michelle, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me by text to read out to Mary to answer in between the discussion session that we're going to have about Mary's books and women in horror and violence against women. Just a fair warning, if you're going to be a troll, we will kick you out. That is our policy. So I'm now going to put Mary on screen. Hi, Mary. Welcome to Read for Pixels.
Hi, everyone. And thank you for having me, Regina. It's really great to be doing something for such a worthwhile cause. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and you are going to read an excerpt from one of your books for us. And just a little trigger warning to everybody. If you are a domestic violence survivor or a stalking survivor, or you dealing with intimate partner violence right now, you may want to go off for the next 10 minutes to get a coffee, get a tea, get some fresh air, because the excerpt that Mary's reading is actually pretty true to life, and it may cause some distress. But it is important that fiction reflects what happens in real life. So Mary's gonna read it out starting now, I think. And yeah, come back in 10 minutes if guys, come back in 10 minutes if this is gonna be triggering, because we're gonna be talking about the excerpt, and we're gonna be talking about, you know, all the issues that the excerpt touches on. So over to you, Mary.
Great. Okay, this is from chapter 2 of Savage Woods, which is available. I'm just trying to make sure it's actually showing up on the camera here. It's available on Amazon.com now. It is not one of the Kathy Ryan books, but she is briefly mentioned in it for people who are interested in, you know, completism, I guess, in that regard. So this is from chapter 2. The last of the police reports that Julia Russo filed against her ex-boyfriend Darren was right before she got lost in the woods. If anyone had told her at 20 that her taste in men was only going to get worse over the next decade and a half, she might have laughed it off, at least outwardly. In her own mind, though, it wouldn't have surprised her. She had never had good luck spotting what others called red flags. She'd come to think of those little odd and sometimes jarring behaviors in other people, particularly in men she dated, as simply personality quirks, many of which she made an effort to accept for a number of reasons. For one, Julia's parents had long drilled into her head that she was not perfect. Far from it, in fact. Each day had been an inevitable catalog of all Julia's personality flaws. Everything from the way she did her hair, a shoulder-length face frame of shining black with a dip always over her eye, to the way she dressed, things that were too tight, too short, or too low cut. She was at times too thin or too chubby. Her job as a corporate administrative assistant was a dead end. Her apartment was a disaster. Her sense of time was nearly non-existent. Her parents' list of her shortcomings was quite extensive, and it drilled into her the idea that if she wasn't perfect, and yet still wanted to be loved, the very least she could do was try to accept the flaws of others. Give what you want to receive, she'd heard once, and it seemed like a pretty good general rule to live by. She also didn't much care for confronting people about how those quirks affected her, another lesson she'd learned from her parents. To voice a concern, to stand up for herself, to offer a constructive criticism, all met with icy silence, followed by a cold shoulder. Confrontation was another surefire way to lose affection. The irony of her parents' criticism of her love life, she'd come to realize, was that they had driven her eventually to date Darren, someone as critical and prone to withhold love as they were. Darren, who at first had seemed so completely opposite her parents, so nurturing and loving and patient, so enamored with all the unique qualities that defined her, so very attracted to her looks and physique. Darren, who had spray-painted whore across her garage door while she was out with her old college roommate in a noisy restaurant one night because he had called her 6 times and she never heard the phone. Darren, who had once tried to burn her hands by holding them tightly against a mug full of hot coffee. Darren, who'd received the restraining order and then buried an axe in her front door. Their relationship had been strained for a long time, probably longer than Julia had truly realized. It had only been maybe 3 or 4 months into the relationship before the first of the quirks appeared. They came in the form of mildly critical and condescending comments toward her and disdain of her relationships with others. He didn't quite call her fat, but he'd shake his head and comment that it was a good thing he was so accepting of her body and the weight he saw that she'd gained. He didn't outright accuse her of cheating, but he'd get so mad when he even thought she was looking at someone else or paying too much attention to another man at a party. His tone of voice, his implications and suggestions, and his disapproving look said far more about his thinking her stupid than any name-calling could. And those things made her second-guess her own words and actions. She began to watch everything she ate, even when he wasn't around. She watched what she said, avoided eye contact with most men, even watched how she dressed. Suddenly, all her endearing quirks had come to annoy him, as they inevitably did everyone, she supposed. She was, after all, flawed, and maybe she wasn't quite seeing the impropriety of her behavior. Maybe she was letting herself go. Maybe she really was embarrassing herself, and him too. She tried to be more on top of her looks, more conservative and tasteful in her dress, more thoughtful and sensitive to his needs, more careful, more observant of how she conducted herself. She tried to be more. It wasn't enough, and over time, she let him convince her that she had changed, as all women eventually change, revealing their shallow self-centeredness, their capacity, like feral and predatory things, to lie and manipulate their way into men's beds and wallets. All women, he told her, were that way underneath. It was a survival mechanism to be so, because they were essentially weak and worthless. They wanted men to think for them, take care of them, put them on pedestals, but that only gave them a sense of entitlement to run roughshod over everybody and everything. Apparently to Darren, she was no exception, though she tried so hard to be. She just kept screwing up. It took time and patience he didn't have with her to learn all his rules, and when she did, those rules seemed to arbitrarily change. She just couldn't quite get the hang of preventing his anger and disapproval, and that seemed to prove to him what an immoral, broken, conniving, weak, flawed creature she must be, despite the little voice in her head telling her that he was the one who had changed. Sometimes he could be outright cruel, displaying an unpredictable and upsetting streak of heartlessness that the little voice desperately pleaded with her to see as more than just a quirk. However, he hadn't been outright abusive, at least she had not truly recognized the behavior as such. He just lost his temper sometimes. He yelled in her face, pushed her around a little, shoved her into walls and furniture, grabbed her arm too tight. But he didn't hit her. Until the day he did. She didn't like to think about it. The day it happened, she knew that she had just had to get out of that relationship. She might have been accommodating to a fault, but that had been too much to accept. She mustered up all the pride she had left and told him it was over. In 2 days, she had deleted his number from her phone, mailed back whatever stuff he'd left at her apartment, and threw away anything she could find that reminded her of him. She felt nothing during the process except the sting of self-reproach and the echo of pain from his fist against her face. That was how she was, how she'd always been. Julia wasn't oblivious to other people's flaws, only too tolerant of them, and for too long. She accepted quirks until they weren't quirks, but acts of betrayal. Once that line was crossed, enough was enough, and then she accepted nothing about the person anymore. That decision was usually final. It certainly was with Darren. She didn't need anyone, least of all the little voice in her head, to tell her that a punch in the mouth was a slingshot from the land of quirks to outright abuse. She was done with Darren for good, and she told him so, then made it clear there was not and would not be anything else to say on the matter. That was when he went from unpleasant to scary. There were the phone calls, which she let her voicemail pick up. Sometimes the messages would be sweet and loving, achingly so. In those messages, he reminded her so much of the man that she had started dating, the man who always told her how pretty she was, how smart and talented she was. He told her he missed her and loved her, that he thought about her all the time, that he'd made a mistake, many of them. But there were other messages, sometimes during the same week or even the same day, that were left in a different tone entirely. In those messages, she was a worthless bitch, useless for everything but the hole between her legs. She was a heartbreaking, soul-crushing cunt, and he should have known better than to trust anything that could bleed for a week every month and not die. In those messages, he swore he'd hurt everyone who ever was or got close to her, family, friends, co-workers, and especially anyone she slept with. After she changed her number, the emails got worse. In between ranting screeds about her, he signed her up for spam, porn, even dating sites. She didn't understand his reasoning regarding the dating sites at first, but when she started getting strange visits from men claiming they'd found her profile on a rape simulation fetish site, she started to get it. That genuinely scared her. It had been hell trying to convince the site to take down her profile, but threats of lawyers finally put an end to the Slutty Slave 69 account, and the passage of a few weeks ended the visits from strange men. Still, the damage was done. She began checking obsessively 4 or 5 times a night before bed to make sure that the doors and windows were locked. She pulled the curtains shut during the day as well as at night. She seldom went out after dark, and when she did, she made a security guard or a coworker walk her to her car. She slept with a letter opener under her pillow and a small kitchen knife just beneath her bed. The police told her they couldn't do much except to take down her statement and file a report. Stalking laws were nebulous at best, and the local police were ill-equipped and minimally trained to handle those sorts of things. There were no threats, after all, no damage to property, no physical violence. She hadn't kept the voicemails. Just seeing his name listed in her missed calls made her feel a little queasy. And they told her it would take some time just to prove the emails were actually coming from Darren. When the phone calls and emails had begun to die off, next came the gifts. Gifts was the word the police used, but to Julia, they were anything but. The flowers maybe were, the living ones, with the note which read, "I'm sorry," in his tight, sharp little script. The dead flowers came with notes too, little things like, "I'm watching," "He won't protect you, bitch," and finally, "They're as dead as you are." After that last note, the police finally started taking her seriously. They went out to visit him and to tell him to knock it off. And then Darren became really dangerous. Julia couldn't quite say she felt better as she drove home from the police station that afternoon. She wanted to. She wanted to believe that the cops would go to his house or his job at the investment firm and arrest him this time, instead of just scold him at the door. She had often lain in bed fantasizing about the police cuffing him in front of that insufferably protective mother of his, or his co-workers, some big show where people would finally be forced to see the monster beneath his polished veneer. She wanted to believe Detective Colby's reassurances that Darren could be in custody by the end of the day. However, there had been too many times where Darren had slipped like a thief through some loophole or other, had paid a fee she couldn't dream of affording, and had been let go with a warning. Detective Colby said none of that was a waste, that it was all a cumulative means to an end, and Julia did believe the detective honestly felt sympathy toward her and wanted to help. However, it often seemed that all Julia's efforts to protect herself from Darren's growing anger and frustration were met with an uptick in those violent emotions that meant harassment, nightmares, sleepless nights, and more gifts. The dead rats laid out in the shape of a heart on her driveway. The slashes in her tires filled with bent nails. The pig blood splashed all over the windshield of her car. Where did a guy like Darren even find so much pig blood? When she bought the security camera, he moved out of view, leaving her a hole dug in the vacant lot across the street, shallow but wide enough for a body, with a crude wooden cross jabbed into the ground at the head of it. In permanent marker, he'd scrawled her name, her birth date, and that day's date. All were violations of the restraining order. All of them he'd done just outside the range of the security camera. But then he'd buried the axe in her front door, and she caught him on the security video doing it. Each prior time, the police came out to look at what he'd done, took pictures and samples for evidence, carefully marked and packaged and removed everything, then hauled her in to file another report. They needed hard evidence, they told her, which could take time. Fingerprints, a hair, a fiber, anything. Julia honestly believed that at that point, they wanted a reason to put Darren away as much as she did. And when Julia called to tell them she'd finally caught Darren in the act, her triumph overshadowed by fear and frustration, Detective Colby was probably more excited than she was. She'd come in with the tape, as he'd asked, and he'd looked fit to do a jig right there in the office. They'd get him this time, and she would be safe. Free. God, she hoped so. As she turned onto Mount Misery Pasadena Road, she wondered what exactly she could have done differently to make Darren leave her alone. She was pretty sure that despite his voice messages to the contrary, it wasn't she who was sending mixed signals. She didn't quite understand why he so fiercely wanted to hold on to her. Why couldn't he just let her go? It seemed that he had bled his obsession into every facet of her life. Everywhere she was, everything she did, his presence overshadowed it all. She was still navigating the fog of these thoughts when a car pulled out behind her. She noticed that he was tailgating her, but it was immediately relegated to the same secondary subcompartment of her mind that other road conditions were. She didn't recognize the car, a bronze-colored Honda CR-V, and so didn't pay all that much attention to the driver. Not until he backed off, slowed down, then sped up enough to hit her car hard, jarring her bones and sending her drifting off onto the shoulder of the road. She tugged on the wheel to right herself and pulled over, shaken. She was about to get out of the car and confer with the driver on the damage when a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror froze her. The man who sat behind the wheel of the Honda looked a hell of a lot like Darren. It was hard to be sure beneath the tinted band along the top of the windshield and the dark sunglasses he wore, but Julia recognized that grim, joyless smile, that hostile drumming on the steering wheel by hands that wanted to hurt something, that lock of black hair and the way he tossed it off his face. It was Darren. She was sure of it in her soul. She started the car again. Before she could pull out onto the road again, though, he floored the gas and rear-ended her, then backed up slightly and slammed into her car again. She heard the ugly whine of metal bending and denting, and the crunch of broken glass as Darren backed up, preparing to hit her again. The impact in her bones, right down to her teeth, was nothing compared to the cold sweat on her skin and the sick ball of fear in her stomach. What the hell was he up to? She jerked the wheel and stepped on the gas pedal, and the car lurched back onto the road. He wanted her to panic and get out of the car, but she wouldn't do it. He could run her over, leave her broken and bleeding on the side of the road, just a mangled piece of debris. Or maybe he had a gun and was planning on shooting her the moment she was free of the car and in range. His rage was different this time. She knew it, could feel it as surely and jarringly in her bones as when he'd hit her car. He wasn't just planning to punch her this time. He was going to obliterate her. She forced herself to take deep breaths until the need to vomit slowly passed. Julia pumped the gas again, and the car made a rattling noise like something was loose somewhere. But it kept moving forward. A hard thud jerked her head and neck forward painfully, and her car skidded across the oncoming traffic lane onto the far shoulder. For a moment, she felt helpless, picked up and carried by a wave of grinding metal. Then the car rolled over something and huffed as if exasperated by all this trouble. Julia wasn't great with cars, but she was pretty sure that sound of displeasure meant that something had punctured her tire. She was tempted to power down the window and peer out, but the thought of Darren taking aim at her and her head exploding like a melon all over the side of her car kept her from doing so. Julia realized then that she should have called the police the moment she thought she recognized Darren behind her, or from the very first ramming of his car into hers at least. But frankly, she had been too surprised to think straight. Sure, Darren had a bad temper, and he was clearly not above crude and threatening little acts of vandalism to scare her into coming back to him. But this was much more intimate, more hands-on, and it had all just seemed so surreal. The idea that someone she had been so vulnerable and intimate with could be capable of such violent anger toward her made that sickness in her core spread to her head and limbs. What had gone so terribly wrong? She pulled her purse onto her lap and rifled through the small pocket in the front. She had her cell phone out and had dialed 911 when the shattering of glass made her scream. She flinched away from the shards as they rained in on her. When she finally dared to look up, Darren stood by the jagged remnants of the broken driver's side window. With one hand, he reached through the window and grabbed her cell phone, which he dropped to the ground and stepped on as she watched. In his other hand, he had an axe. He has an axe. She gaped for a minute, mostly at the axe, still unable to convince herself this was really happening. Why? She asked him, though no more than the shape of the word formed on her lips. No sound came out. Then she looked him in the eyes. There was no real outward display of anger or hatred, but there was nothing even remotely resembling the spark of love or understanding either, or even the simple flicker of humanity. His eyes were dead spaces, twin voids. There was no Darren in there. Not the man she'd fallen in love with, certainly, but not even the man he'd become over those last few weeks. That Darren was still human, however flawed and unbalanced. What drove this version of him from the seat of his mind was something else. His expression never changed. He looked perfectly calm. His mouth was a thin fault line in the placid geography of his face. His eyebrows were neither knitted nor arched. He was not breathing heavily. He wasn't showing signs that any of this was affecting him at all. If he had, she might have entertained some hope of pleading with him. He opened the driver's side door. She hadn't thought to lock it in all the confusion, and grabbed her arm, yanking her out of the car with her purse still clutched tightly to her. His grip was inescapable, though, the muscles straining like a bundle of steel cables in his arm. The world blurred for a second, and in the next, she was on the ground with the wind knocked out of her. He balanced the axe against his shoulder and took a few steps toward her. The thought that crossed her mind was that he was going to chop her up. He didn't want her body identified, so he was going to dismember her. He wanted her to rot right there at the edge of the woods with wild animals carrying away whatever pieces were left. She felt sick. He hadn't spoken a word, and that scared the hell out of her, so much so that when he hoisted the axe over his head, it took her a few seconds to react. She heard the sharp voice of the wind zipping around the blade as it sliced through the air toward her, and that, more than anything, sent her rolling out of the way. She came to a stop near some bushes and felt something soft, like skin, against her arm. She turned and discovered her arm was still tangled in the long, thin strap of her purse. Julia considered for a moment swinging the purse at him, trying to trip him up or throw him off balance, but it wasn't quite big enough or heavy enough for that. She pulled it to her anyway, gripping it like a medieval flail, and scrambled backwards into the brush. He was coming towards her. She clumsily got to her feet and took off into the woods.
Yeah, you described what abusers do. And I'm going to tell you one thing. When I read, I'm happy through the book. I read all the Kathy Ryan books. I'm happy through this book. And when I read the line that says, tightened, hand on the arm. Yeah, let's just say one of my exes did that. And
oh, yeah.
Sure sign that, at some point it's going to escalate. So it is very accurate. What's the research you do, or how do you write it so accurately? That's why we had the trigger warning, because when I read it, I'm thought like a lot of domestic violence survivors and stalking survivors, they will recognize this and it might bring up some bad memories. So how do you write such a realistic vignette?
Well, I'd like to say that it was all secondhand research, but it isn't. I'd be surprised if there were very many women, unfortunately, who couldn't speak to having some experience, at least in some part, like that. I had a few exes who some of that I'm not all of it, obviously, because some of it's fiction, but some of that really is real. Some of it did happen. Some of those things, are things people, exes have said to me. Some of that behavior, and also a lot of the mindset that goes along with accepting that behavior, uh, is personal. Some of the other stuff that didn't happen to me, I know have happened to people who are victims of stalking by a domestic partner. And in at least 2 of the 3 cases that I drew examples from, the stalker eventually killed the person that he was stalking. And it always horrified me that these overt signs of threat, these violent things that these women would report to police. And it wasn't that the police didn't want to help. It was that in a lot of ways, the laws are designed to tie their hands. And there's just not a whole lot of recourse. You can't stop a person for doing what you know he's going to do. You can only stop him once he's done it. And so I think a lot of these women are in a bad, a bad situation, that it's they want to protect themselves, but the cops can't do anything until the people who want to hurt them actually hurt them. So a lot of it is drawn from either personal experience or experience of people that I know, or that I've, read about, or, domestic abuse cases, stalking cases. Unfortunately, a lot of it escalates that way.
Yeah, and I've worked in Pixel. Pixel is now 10 years old. We just turned 10 in January. We, activists talk, and we cover the whole gamut of different forms of violence against women. And our sister activists working, specializing in domestic violence, which will include stalking, marital rape, and all that. They are unless you're in Scotland, where they keep passing laws to keep tightening and tightening, even verbal and psychological abuse is now on the table. In most countries, the police's hands are tied, or the police themselves tell you, well, you shouldn't have made him angry.
Right. Yeah. There are unfortunately, there's also a wide range of responses that you read, like, well, that's just between you and your husband, or that's between you and your boyfriend, or we didn't want to get involved, or like you said, you shouldn't have made him angry. You shouldn't have done that thing that annoyed him. A lot of times, abusers will say, it's not me. Everybody thought so. Everybody thought you did this thing wrong. Everybody, all my friends think that you're this horrible person too. And they try to make you feel isolated increasingly isolated. And that's the other thing that I think I wanted to capture in the book, because I feel like it's such a raw horror for women, is the subtle and sinister escalation from the little things which hurt your feelings, or hurt your sense of pride, to the big things which can really hurt your entire person. It's sad, and it's scary.
Yeah, and the fact that it has been calculated that the first 6 months of leaving your abuser is the most dangerous period of time. A lot of women and children, or their loved ones who are trying to protect them, somebody gets maimed, somebody lands up in the hospital, somebody sadly gets killed.
Yes. And the other things too is that they often tell you, oh, well, he can't do anything worse than he's already done. I'm sure he'll forget about it. In fact, the probably the most abusive relationship, they kept telling me after I broke up with him, was like, all right, well, then it's over now. It's over. No, I mean, he stalked me for like a month, 2 months after that. I mean, it was a long time, and it was relentless. It was like every day or every other day. And they kept saying, well, he's not going to do those things that he says he's going to do. But to a woman who's been in that situation, he's done all those things up until that point that he said he was going to do. So there's not a whole lot to go on to believe that he's not going to do the more violent things he says he's going to do. You know, I remember this particular individual telling me, I'm going to kill everybody you care about. I'm going to kill everybody that tries to get close to you. And that's scary, because that's not about you anymore. That's about other people that, you know, as a woman, as a mother or daughter or sister, you want to protect the people you love. You don't want them to be, and especially you don't want them to be victims of people that you brought into their lives, you know, however well-meaning it was, you know. So there's a lot of nuances there that I wish women were more aware that it's not all them. It's not their fault. You know, it's not something wrong with them or something, you know, something that they did. You know, sometimes you people are just too damaged for whatever reason that you can't fix them. You can't help them, and you can't be what they want you to be. And you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to try.
Yeah, and you know, we're going to talk about this a little later in the session, but you know, it is never your fault. It is the other person's choice. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the current, you know, I'm going to say it right now, it is male violence, usually 90, at least 95% of the cases, it is male violence. If they say they're going to hurt someone around you, they will, which is why we also have a campaign. Our campaigns are kind of like, we're also focused on dads getting great to speak up, because they are parenting.
Right.
Parenting the next generation, because we're hoping to just stop it right there. And
Right.
you know, reports are coming in. You know, it's basically a long game, right? You have to look at, if we can't stop this generation, we're going to have to do better with the next generation of boys.
Right. Right.
And also, you know, we look at pets, because you know, frequently abuses, you know, when the police tell you, you know, oh, he's not going to do that. Yes, he is. We know that abusers are going to hold the kids hostage. We know that they're going to hold the pets hostage, especially. And the two things, pets, kids, and if you have any elderly relatives that are living with you or within vicinity, they're going to do that. And, you know, a lot of shelters, you know, shelters are very badly funded. They are not funded nearly to the point, you know, nearly enough. They need more funding. And of course, we know right now, in the middle of the perfect storm, which is, well, that orange, I'm not going to say anything in the you know, that domestic violence shelters nearly did not get their funding because of the government shutdown. And also, the Me Too movement is pushing this worldwide. You know, it has got to be, you know, we're pushing on one end, and on the other end, it's kind of like trying to turn the Titanic around. And basically, because of the whole funding issue, you know, a lot of shelters are now working really hard to raise funds so that they can also have childcare. They can also offer childcare. They can also offer, you know, a kennel built next to them so that women can bring their kids and their pets with them. They can also partner with local child welfare and pet welfare organizations to get them all out there. But the thing is, like you said, the abuser is using the people around his victim as hostages. And it comes down to the C word, control. They want to control. It is all about control. It is not anger management, despite what some judges think and some law enforcement officers think. It comes down to they want to have control. So yeah, so that's why the excerpt that you just read, that totally shows that it is down to control, and they get furious when they can no longer control you, they can no longer reach you, they can no longer and when they can't control you, they try to control the situation around you, and that is
Right.
another form of abuse. So so the questions are rolling in from the audience. I think I'm gonna just state it right now. We'll be here for another about 45 minutes because we're also gonna discuss women in your books and Kathy Ryan and writing horror, and there are quite a lot of questions about writing difficult topics and writing horror. So guys, we will be interspersing your questions we'll be weaving it into the discussion session. Please stay through it with that. It's going to be, Mary's going to be talking a lot about writing, a lot about genre, a lot about writing female characters as well, and the geek culture in general. So let's get started with that. So let's talk about Kathy Ryan. So
Okay.
before we went on air, I said Kathy reminds me of is a cross between Fox Mulder and with Fox's belief in the supernatural and paranormal and the fantastic, and Dana's very, very Dana covers everything. She's very thorough. So Kathy is is the best of both characters in one really kick-ass female character, even when she's
Thank you.
when supernatural forces have cut up her leg and she can barely walk. Or they throw her into the freezing river and they want to try to drown her. She manages, she's like a superhero almost. Like, job done. And so she's fantastic. She's intelligent, resourceful, and skilled. She's basically a survivor. And even in the face of fear, that is what struck me. Even when she is so afraid, she gets things done. So who or what inspired you to create Kathy?
It's funny. When I picture her in my head, I picture an old boss that I had when I was about 16. It was the first job I ever had, and she was my manager. And she was one of those people that I thought, okay, I'm going to butt heads because I have authority issues. At least I had authority issues as a teenager, and I thought I'm not going to like this woman because she's very tough. She's not coddling. She's not warm and fuzzy at all. But it turns out that once you got to know her, if you got her respect, she was an incredible person, an incredible ally to have in a workforce situation or in a personal situation. In fact, she may have talked me through, if I'm remembering, I'm trying to remember the timeline, one of the relationships I had which wasn't going well, and she said, forget this guy, you deserve better. When I imagine Kathy, I know that a lot of thriller female protagonists they come across as being like they want to portray a strong woman, right? But what they end up doing, I think, is as much a disservice to women as making them look weak and frail and silly by making them this sort of varnished, shiny, plastic, perfect person. Because most people in the world they're not always strong. They're not always, perfectly coiffed and perfectly made up. They're not always making the right decisions. And so I wanted to write Kathy as the same kind of person that we see and accept in male characters all the time. Somebody who's really very damaged in some ways, even suicidal in some ways. And yet, when it comes down to it, does the best she can for other people around her. I mean, we see this in men all the time and we just accept it. We either accept as caricatures in fiction and movies, we either accept women who are absolutely perfect, these sort of Venuses that spring forth from, perfect loins somewhere, or we have these sort of weak foils for men to save and rescue. I wanted to find somebody who's kind of in the middle, somebody that could be loved but never quite trusted why she could be loved, somebody who had a dark past, somebody who drinks too much, somebody who maybe doesn't have the kind of social filter that women are taught their whole lives to have. You're taught to be polite, you're taught not to be aggressive, you're taught to be ladylike, and Kathy isn't always that way, but she still has a lot of feminine qualities that make her more than just a man with boobs. Basically, I tried to find a way to make her more complex, to make her a woman that women could relate to.
Yeah, and she was relatable, and I think she also, in a way, if what you brought up is something that we noticed. We were chatting before we went on air. That we've interviewed with 100 authors, and it is an issue. It is an issue that writing female characters can be a difficult thing, because it is difficult not to fall into stereotypes, and obviously different authors use different methods, and we'll talk about yours a little later, different methods of avoiding that. But when we think about our moms and our female teachers and coaches, and the older women who who are in their 60s and 70s, and who are still driving, still helping with childcare, still at work. We think of Gloria Steinem. She's 80 something. She's still she's still working. Women are tough.
Oh
They
yeah.
are tough. We are not perfect. We are people. We are human, right? But we have to be tough, because a lot of times we are juggling childcare, we are juggling our work, we are dealing with the wider world, and in many countries we are still dealing with cultures that treat us as second-class citizens or not quite human. We're dealing with laws, like you said just now. We're dealing with laws that don't believe us when we're abused, or which reinforce the social contract around it is acceptable to certain forms of abuse are acceptable. So Kathy is one character that does reflect all that complexity. Yes, we are vulnerable. We are, because we are placed by society in that position where we have very few cards in our hands.
Right.
But we fight back, and that is why Kathy is so awesome. Even with all the physical pain, nearly being drowned, her brother attempting to rape her, all that trauma, she still is able to. She reminds me of Ripley. All that trauma.
Thank you.
Sexism, all those monsters. And the iconic picture we all know is her with Newt, carrying Newt like a mom on one hip, and carrying, and carrying a weapon in the other arm, and both of them surviving. And it's sort of like a visual representation of, we don't do that. We're not that extreme in real life for most women. Kathy is, I think, maybe a couple of generations down from Ripley, but she is that sort of woman where she will fight to protect the kids. And I find the daughter as a little girl, and she is like, we will, and what is great about that is that the girl wanted to come along to help, and the mom was like, oh, I don't know, and she said, look, if she wants to help, she can help. We need all the hands. There are not that many people who have all the arms and legs and faculties. And if she wants to help, let her help, but we will protect her the best we can. That's not shielding her from the harshness of life, but that is making darn sure that she is as protected as possible when she is dealing with it. And that is what women do for their kids, and do for their families, and do for their communities. And that is reflected in the Kathy Ryan books. And what's interesting about the series is that Kathy does face a lot of misogyny and sexism, but many of her male peers, when working with her on a case, they do right off the bat or eventually treat her with respect, because she is a specialist in occult. They are not. And they don't condescend to her, they don't mansplain to her. Is this a conscious decision on your part to make sure that the male characters do eventually cotton on to, she actually knows more than them? So
I think I don't know that it was so much necessarily in the first book. In the first book, I assume that she would be self-conscious, but women can exhibit, much like men, can exhibit self-consciousness either by folding in, and being sort of shy and retiring and sort of a wallflower, or you can pretend, you can walk with swagger. You can walk like it's not going to bother you. And that's what Kathy does. I mean, she's got a very physical representation of trauma on her face. She's got a scar. And I think that initially it was more that, in that sort of tradition of a lot of detectives that have like weird personality quirks, like Sherlock Holmes and Monk, and they're almost not quite great with people. The fact that she's a woman on top of that in a profession that I would say until recently and probably still now is largely male dominated and maybe not always very warm and welcoming to women, because there's a certain physical component to being in any kind of enforcement role. I think it's sort of a combination of those things. And once I saw that was the case, I also didn't want to say, okay, well, I didn't want to stereotype her and being, here's a bunch of dumb men and here's this smart woman coming in and explaining everything. But I wanted them to be able to, emerge as complex men as well. Men who are probably raised in generations where they are just like, women are raised not to be assertive. Men are raised to be assertive. And these men are, probably would have been of a generation that's raised to protect women and to, to take the lead in a lot of these situations. And they can't because they are, like you said, missing this knowledge that she has. What I think, in the first book, that I think they almost tend to look after her, but because that's one of the things interesting about writing a series is that she's growing and changing too. In some ways, she's getting stronger mentally. In other ways, the job is starting to wear on her. It's the same with the people around her, though. In some ways, they're dismissive of her because she's a woman and because she's a little crazy to work with. But over time, her reputation is spreading, and people, to the point where in the very newest book, they send out a memo and they said, this occult specialist is coming. Give her whatever she needs. If she asks you for something, you represent the police force. You are the face of this police force. You show her respect and you give her what she needs. She's in charge. And, it's kind of an interesting thing about a series that you can develop that about her.
Yeah. So we have a number of questions from the audience. Guys, I'm gonna ask the ones that we're going in different. We're discussing several different topics here. So as we go along, I will ask the questions either in between the discussion clusters, or I will ask the questions that are linked to a particular discussion cluster. So it might not go in the exact order in which you guys have asked the questions, but we are here for another about half an hour or so. So let's get going with the first one that is related to this one. It's from Anne Marble. Hi, Anne. She asks, how are you able to make readers care about characters who do terrible things, such as some of the characters in Behind the Door?
Yes, some of the characters in Behind the Door are what society, and I would say probably 99% of the population would say are not good people. But here's the thing. When you go to develop a monster, let's say, like a genuine monster that you want people to be afraid of, what the outer costume of that monster is, what the outer shell of it is not as important as what it represents on the inside. It's that people relate to. It's the horror, the universal fear of that what that monster represents that people relate to. When you're making human monsters, you have that added component that they are already human beings. But when you want to make them sympathetic monsters, then you have to look at it certain universal truths about people. Everybody has done something that they wish they hadn't. Everybody has some part of their past that they probably regret, some way that they hurt somebody, or and I guess I was curious to see if what would be the limits to, I guess with the readership, what would be the limits to what kind of sins and crimes could a person commit and still be sympathetic, still be somebody that you could find that you root for? And I think that the shift from, a very black and white view of the world, especially in entertainment, has it started years ago. I mean, you look at somebody like Tony Soprano in The Sopranos. He's a killer and he's a mobster. He wouldn't be somebody that you'd find sympathetic, except you do. Dexter is a serial killer, and yet you root for him. Hannibal Lecter, serial killer, and yet you kind of want him to win. So I think the case is that you have to find those universal things that ignite empathy and sympathy, without steamrolling, any kind of stereotype over other people. So for good characters or bad characters, it's the same with Kathy Ryan. I think, it's a matter of finding the thing that people can universally empathize or sympathize with. And even if the person has done bad things, ultimately, I think we're all basically optimists. At least when we're looking at entertainment, we want the good guys to win, and we want the people who want redemption to find it.
Yeah. So, let's talk about horror as a genre and writing in horror. So it seems that horror, in both modern and folk storytelling, because horror has very, very long and old roots, even in fairy tales, which everyone knows now are sanitized,
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, they have traditionally not been kind to female figures and characters, not just women, but, any other female character who is a supernatural paranormal being. Women are portrayed as everything from murderers like Lizzie Borden and Dracula's handmaidens to victims. Countless horror movies have, the first victim is that little blonde woman who screams.
Right.
Yeah. So, it has a share of female stereotypes and tropes. So how do you work around some of these stereotypes to create female characters that aren't aren't like fridged or just there for a reason for man pain, as Chuck Wendig
Right.
How do we do that? How do we break those tropes and stereotypes?
Well, I think this is sort of a multifaceted process. I think as far as horror goes, one of the things that I and a lot of other horror writers try to promote is this idea that horror itself is not all about the torture porn aspect. It's not all about the sort of prurient desire to watch people get hurt. That horror's always kind of been about the human beings becoming more than they were before, becoming almost heroic in a way, becoming symbols of hope. And sometimes that requires sacrifice. Sometimes that requires them being an example of what not to be. And sometimes it requires them being something that we wouldn't expect, or something even they wouldn't expect. When it comes to women in horror, women who write horror, women in general, our whole lives we're taught to be afraid. We're taught to be afraid of strangers. We're taught to be afraid of, letting teenage boys be alone with us in a car. We're taught all kinds of things. We're taught to be afraid to walk in the dark by ourselves across a parking lot, at the local grocery store, because we might be attacked. And so fear, and also, I think a lot of people don't generally tend to really realize this, is women are physically not as strong as men, generally speaking. And that is something that's always in the back of our heads, that we are, in that one respect, weaker than men. I couldn't bench press the same thing that, say, a man my age and my height and weight could bench press, because we don't have the same physical makeup, So I think, and women also are emotional creatures. And what is horror really but an emotion, a powerful driving emotion that helps us survive. So I think women are often very uniquely designed to write horror. I don't believe that this makes us better horror writers than men or worse horror writers than men, but it does give us a unique perspective on horror, which very much focuses on the emotional. And I think that that's what people are starting to connect to more and more. The other thing about writing women characters and getting around those tropes is that when I said about I look at three things when I said about writing, a woman character. One, when I was a kid, I remember asking my dad, well, how come girls aren't as strong as boys? Like, how come, like the little boy down the street can knock me over, but I can't knock him over? And he said, well, little boys might be stronger, but little girls have endurance. Little girls have a much higher tolerance for pain. And when I thought about it, and when he, explained it a little more, I mean, we give birth to children. Scientifically, we are theoretically supposed to have a higher threshold for pain. And there was something so empowering about that, something so like, wow, okay, maybe we can't inflict the same kind of pain, but we can survive longer. We're surviving creatures because we deal with pain on a different level. So I think of that. I think of the fact that women innately are survivalist type people. I also think that women, when we make decisions, we put as much stock in our intuition, into our gut instinct, into how something feels, as we do into the intellectual portion of a decision. And I think when you're writing a woman character, you need to take that into account. Men tend to think very logically, very linearly, and very practically. When they make a decision, it's primarily intellectual. Not always, but primarily it's an intellectual decision. When women make decisions, it's as much an emotional decision as an intellectual decision because we trust that part of us. We've been taught that it's okay to trust that part of us. I think a lot of men, unfortunately, aren't taught, or at least for generations were not taught, that you can trust your instinct. You can trust how a decision will make you feel as being just as valid as what you think a decision will result in. And then the third component of that is that I think that the reason why women's stories are told differently than men, the man's hero's journey is essentially learning to be from starting as an individual person and learning to be something to someone else, learning to be a hero, learning to be a leader, learning to be a father or a husband or a symbol or a spokesperson. If you look at Batman, you look at William Wallace.
Sorry.
You look at even Frodo in Lord of the Rings, or Luke Skywalker. All of these characters started off as an individual who was really kind of only responsible for himself, learning to be something to someone, learning to be responsible for others and take other people's feelings and lives and well-being into account, which suits men because they go from being little boys who are taken care of to being men who are generally taught to take care of their families. For women, it's the opposite, and I think a lot of people don't always write women characters that way. We are always something to someone. We are always, by default, a daughter, a sister, a mom.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Just in mind of the recent, Stephen and Tabitha King and the whole that headline thing.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. We are always so-and-so's girlfriend, so-and-so's wife, so-and-so's mom, or so-and-so's kid. Our hero's journey and all of the successful movies with women, including successful horror movies that feature primarily women, show that role. And then our journey is to become something for ourselves. And usually that means, in a lot of cases in horror, it means surviving for no one else but us. Learning what we are capable of, what we can do on our own. And I think that's the difference. I think if you're going to write successful women characters, you need to kind of keep those three things in mind as you're developing them.
Yeah. And horror stories all feature some sort of violence. And as I think I mentioned a little earlier, sometimes it includes, or a lot of times it includes violence against women. How do you show the balance, find the balance between showing violence as an integral part of the story? Because a lot of times in horror, some sort of violence is the inciting incident. And then it goes from there. And not, how do you find balance between that and not showing violence gratuitously?
I believe that even in stories of extreme, maybe even especially in stories of extreme horror, but in any kind of horror story, I think that you only show enough violence for the reader or the watcher to fully understand the nature of the threat you're suggesting. And then that's all you need. A lot of stuff, a lot of the most graphic quote horror happens off screen because what we imagine is so much worse than anything we could ever actually show. So I think that the difference between graphic violence and gratuitous violence is intent. Like in Savage Woods, there's a particularly graphic scene of one of the tree creatures killing someone, and it's not only is it probably the first time I've ever been that graphic in any of my books, but it's also the first time in the book that anything is that graphic. And it's simply because it's the first time these tree people show the extent of what they can do. And there's a reason for that. It's meant to be a point in the book where you're like, oh my God, wow. And then the rest of it isn't as graphic because you don't need it to be. You know what these tree people can do. You know the extent of their abilities, or you at least can imagine how much further this can go. And I think that gratuitous violence is violence that's in there unnecessarily. I think that if you're going to approach, because I mean, I've had stories that have had child abuse, I've had stories that have had rape, I've had stories, obviously, that have stalking. And I think that there's a certain reverence to the topic, a certain respect to the topic that, makes the difference between graphic and gratuitous by respecting the reader's sense of imagination. As long as you know this is the level of horror I'm talking about, I don't need to giggle about it and beat you over the head with it. This is enough.
Yeah, and it sort of feeds into you. I think you sort of partially answered the question by Zach Dozier. Sorry if I mispronounce your name, Zach. Zach asks, Zach's question is basically related to this. He says, in horror, a lot of sensitive subject matters get written about. How does the writer handle these topics without being insensitive or exploitative? I think you've answered part of that, right?
Right. I think exploitation really, there's a different purpose there. Now, and I like 99% of horror fans I've met, they're sweet, delightful people. And I don't think that horror fans are any more twisted for liking horror than I would expect anyone to think I am for writing it. However, to me, exploitation or gratuitous violence is generally done in a way that's targeted toward people who enjoy, in a sort of sadistic way, enjoy seeing people in pain, whether there's a sexual component to that or not. And I think that's the difference. I think your intent shows through, and your targeted audience shows through in how you handle these topics. Like I said, if you're showing this as a bad thing, you're showing this as a horrific act, which again can be very graphic, but is clearly meant to horrify. That's okay. You can do that. But I think when there's that sense that you're somehow giving it a pass, that you're somehow giving it permission, that it is somehow amusing or entertaining in some way, then it's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we talked about women in horror. So let's talk about men in horror. Well,
okay.
No characters in horror. That's just this question that we at the Pixel Project we were talking about this the other day. Do you think there is room in horror for reframing how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes like alpha males, um, and towards complexity and even vulnerability? Do you think this can be one of the ways that writers can break away from toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
I do. I think the same as we can show women as having autonomy and agency in their own decision making. I think that there's a lot of times, there's a certain comfort in seeing in these crisis situations, seeing people that we know can take charge and get things done. I think it's why we tend to like to see alpha males. And I wouldn't necessarily want to see that eradicated, because I think that, in a lot of horror situations, you need somebody to emerge as a doer. Uh, However, there are other kinds of men in the world. There are the people who are the right hand man. There are the people who don't necessarily think to grab a weapon and barricade the doors, but still can offer something useful in another way. And I think the best way to handle it is to show, just like we show, diversity in terms of race and gender and orientation. I think that we show a diversity of men and accept these men in all ways, whether they're alpha males, whether they're, even stereotypes in the past that we have made toxic. If we can show why they are that way, then we can engender a certain amount of sympathy or empathy, and show them as well-rounded people and not, two-dimensional stereotypes. But also I think that we should have more emerging characters who are not alphas. Like in the sequel to the movie Sinister, I thought Sinister was absolutely brilliant. But one of the things I loved about the sequel is that the unnamed deputy, who, if I remember correctly, remains unnamed throughout the sequel of Sinister, he's not an alpha male at all. He's like the chair guy. I think they call it in science fiction or comics, they call him the guy in the chair. He's almost like the guy in the chair. He's the right hand man. He's the guy that the main character sends and says, go look this up for me and let me know what you find out. And he carries the movie as the main character. But what's fascinating is how he reacts to situations. It's just as effective, but it's different. And it was neat to see a sort of different approach to having to emerge as a leader when it's not in a person's nature to do so.
Yeah. And stories are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about cultural change. I mean, the way culture is transmitted is stories.
Right.
All our cultural ideas and stuff, it's all a huge narrative, isn't it? And it's kind of like, changing the narrative, changing what we teach our kids, changing what we tell men and all, changing the way we see gender and all that. A lot of change is happening now, and a lot of it is going on in pop culture, in the news, what we hear, anecdotes from people. So let's talk about that. So, in mystery and thrillers, there's the Staunch Prize that was launched about a couple of years ago, and it's basically, it would go to a thriller in which no woman is beaten, stalked, sexually exploited, raped, or murdered. And there was a lot of debate, and the first winner was announced recently, and it's an Australian writer, and he wrote about, I think he wrote about trafficking and stuff, but it did not have overt violence against women. So do you think such a prize might work for the horror genre? Is it possible to write horror without violence against women?
I think it's possible. I think it's tough to write in the horror genre without violence, period. However, that being said, I know that there are, there, like my first novel, The Hollower, spoiler alert, there are no deaths in it. No immediate deaths. No deaths. No on-screen deaths, I should say. So yes, I think it is possible to do it. It's possible to create an atmosphere where it's not about the killing, but maybe about the fear of death, or maybe it's more of a psychological thing that you're afraid of instead of actual violence toward a person. I do think there are movies which do that. I think there are books that do that. I think there are things that cover the threat of violence, maybe without any actual violence taking place. And I think that that can be incredibly scary. In fact, we were talking about these abusive relationships. Most of the people I have talked to that have been in violent relationships have said that it was never the beatings that scared them. It was the threat of the beatings. The beatings were almost, I don't want to say that they were almost like a comfort, but they were an expectation. So there was no real fear. Like once it started, it was like, okay, well, now I know what the worst is going to be. But the most traumatizing to these people was always that threat that it was coming, and you never knew when it was coming. You never knew what you'd do to set a person off. And so I do think it's possible, but um, I think it would have to be sort of a reframing of what horror is. It'd have to be more of a psychological thing, I think, or something where maybe the violence is reflected on, or they're worrying about it happening as opposed to ever actually seeing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think some of the more old-fashioned ghost stories that rely on psychological, like one of my favorite movies is actually The Others, because they don't know.
That's a great example. I was thinking about that. Yeah.
It's parallel worlds. And what is spooky about it is that if you talk to people who do, I'm in Asia, guys, just to give context, and we do respect. I mean, it's because the horror stories and movies that come out from Asia are very different from the ones from the West, and
Right.
we're always pretty respectful, even if we go around declaring that I'm not superstitious. We're always very respectful of it, and it is. When I watched The Others when it came out, it was very scary and very spooky, and I think James Wan has it in his series as well on the ghosts, The Conjuring. That there's a sensibility there that knowing that it's lurking there, that there is a parallel world, and knowing that it's bleeding in is scary. But when it happens, it's kind of like, okay, we'll deal with it, and then raise up of it. But like you said, that whole like, oh no, when is it gonna happen? That kind of makes a lot of people go, I want to go to the bathroom.
Absolutely. I think those kind of stories now, especially for younger generations who've grown up, under the shadow of, 9/11, and under the shadow of, civil wars in their countries, and, to the point where like here we have terrorist drills and school shooting drills for children in kindergarten, and so to them, violence isn't, their video games are violent. Their news, the stuff on the news is violent. To them, it's not the violence that's scary anymore. It's like you said, the supernatural stuff. The idea that beyond the violence, if the ultimate worst possible end of violence is death, that there's something even scarier and worse beyond that. And I think that's what's scaring people nowadays. And that tends to be the horror I gravitate toward myself.
Yeah. So we're gonna Shane Carr has a question. He's actually the person who asked the first question. So Shane, sorry about getting to it so late, but it's your question is now related to what we're talking about. He says, Mary, what's your best advice to new writers and to horror writers in particular?
My best advice would probably be, when people tell you write what you know, it means write what you know here in your heart. Write what you know, write what you're passionate about, and don't be afraid of it. I spent a lot of years writing horror that was essentially sanitized, because I didn't write about the things that scared me. I wrote about the things that I figured scared other people. But the horror that has resonated the most with readers has been the horror where I have opened the floodgates and written about the things that genuinely scare me. So a lot of step of the way, when you're a new writer, you're afraid of criticism. You're afraid of not finishing something. You're afraid of submitting things. You're afraid that once it does sell, nobody's going to read it. Nobody's going to like it. Every step of the way, be fearless and just, write what's in your heart and soul, and don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of any step of the process, because all of us are here in the trenches with you and we know how it feels. So just go for it.
Yeah. So we're going to try and wrap up in about 10 minutes or so. So let's talk about geek culture.
Okay.
And horror is the subgenre of geek culture. It's all under one umbrella. And so it has its share of critics saying that it is still too male dominated despite a rising number. And in fact, I'm not even going to say a rising number. There are so many prominent, well-respected, and well-known female authors. And do you think? I mean, let's narrow it down to the horror community. Do you think the same thing can be said of the horror community, that despite having luminaries like Mary Shelley and Shirley Jackson, that it is still too male dominated?
I seem to remember hearing a statistic not long ago, actually, it was within the last year, that said that the current ratio of women to men is something like 2 or 3 to, it'd be like for every 10 writers, 2 or 3 of them are women and the rest are men. So if you have a table of contents, an anthology where, let's say, you've got 10 writers, if 7 or 8 of them are men and 3 are women, then we're fairly represented, surprisingly enough. I think what it is, it's a case of history. It's a case of long-standing history. Men have been writing in this field longer. So while there are a number of us who write horror, and I think especially, recently, maybe within the last 5 years or so, are starting to really be recognized as professionals in our own right, I think when it comes to the major outlets for publication and promotion, there's still this idea that we'll go with the people that we trust, that we know can deliver something to us, that have had a long history of being popular with our readers and bringing us money. And I mean, publishing is a business, and businesses want to make money. I don't think that we have the same historical, maybe, name recognition. And I'm hoping that changes in the next 10 years or so, that we will have been around long enough that, because I'm starting to see it now. I'm starting to see publishers saying, I like your stuff, I'd like to work with you, can you send me something? And what I find really kind of warm and fuzzy about that is that when it's a new editor or somebody that I don't know, a lot of times is say, well, this male friend of yours that I do trust recommended me to you, and I trust his judgment, and I want to go. And then really all you need is to get in the door. What we need to prove is that we can make money for the people that we're working for. And then I really think that shift is going to change. Now, to get over that obstacle of, how we prove we're going to make money is basically just what people are doing. Like, Brian Keene recommends women writers to publishers because, they trust his judgment. Christopher Golden recommends women writers to people because, to editors and agents and people he talks to, they trust his judgment. I know a lot of men that do that, and it's very affirming to us, because as kind as these guys are, they're not going to ruin their reputation by recommending people that they don't have faith in. And so, but now once we get our foot in the door, it's up to us to bring our A game and show, hey, this is what women can do. This is the money we can make you. So, good on you for picking us.
Kind of ironic though, because I mean the Kathy Ryan series is also a mystery thriller, and Agatha Christie is the biggest selling author of all time. They crunched the numbers. It's, her books are still selling like hotcakes. People are
Mhm.
still reading it, and yet, despite showing that women can write, can bring in the money, but still, female authors are still struggling to get a foot in.
Mhm.
So
We're still new. Yeah, in this particular genre, we're still relatively new. I don't think we have the historical backing that men do, and I think it's the same in a lot of genres where men, pretty much dominated the marketplace for a long time. For the genres where women either started it or it was always sort of something that people felt were geared toward women readers. Women don't have that problem, but men do. So I think that with us in horror, it's we can bring in money and we can bring in readership and we can manage the renown those kind of sales will garner. But I think I think it's just a matter of having been around long enough that
mhm.
we've developed those kinds of reputations with and I hate to use the word gatekeepers, but with the people who are still pretty much in charge of all these prominent outlets for uh, disseminating horror fiction.
Yeah, and I think across geek culture, I mean, across publishing the different genres, they are trying. I mean, Tor is trying so hard with their novella. They specifically say, we're looking for authors of underrepresented populations, writing stories about underrepresented populations,
Right.
and it is always a good thing. And that this culture wars are still being waged across. I mean, I don't know if you saw that, but no, we're not Facebook friends. But 2 days ago, I wrote a rant going, why do I have to keep explaining that it is a good thing to have diversity? It is a good thing to welcome authors from underrepresented. So yeah, but anyway, I think we should wrap up soon. So let's go to the final question. Well, it's a two-part question. And
Okay.
it seemed like a Captain Obvious question, but we do ask it. We have to. So you have been so very incredibly supportive of our work in general and our Read for Pixels campaign. So here are the two parts of the question. One, why do you support the Pixel Project and the cause to end violence against women? And two, in your opinion, how can authors like yourself best support efforts to kick off the social and cultural change to end violence against women?
Okay. So for part one,
Uh-huh.
I think it is absolutely uh, crucial that, I mean, we make up, I think, more than half the population of the world, women. And one of the reasons I got into writing horror was to sort of rebalance, my sense of the world with all these horrible things that happen and all this, you know, this violence toward, women and children and just, the horrible things that people do to each other every day, every little injustice, every little terror. Uh, I think horror writers write so that they're not afraid anymore. And when you look at real life horrors, like some of these women endure, if there's a way to take that fear away from them, if there's a way to write the world in a real world sense, rebalance things and make it so that um, we can identify the monster, drag it out into the light and kill it. uh, I'm all for that. I think it's easy to say, of course I support stopping violence against women because I'm a woman, but really it's more uh, that I support people having freedom to live lives where you're not afraid of uh, burning dinner. You're not afraid of you know picking the show on TV that you want to watch because you think someone's going to yell at you. You're not afraid of sitting up tall, in the car, in the passenger seat of a car, because you're afraid that your head's going to get in his way when he's trying to look, in both directions to see what, which way the traffic is coming. I want people to feel safe. There's enough in this world that we need to worry about killing us. We shouldn't have to worry about the people we love the most. And then the second part of the question is, I think that one way that we can change that is, I think that women now, with the Me Too movements and a lot of these movements now, we're in a position where maybe possibly for the first time, or that people are actually listening to what we have to say. And I think that's a great responsibility. I think it's a responsibility that we work to educate and illuminate, and we work to rebalance things so that there's equality without isolating the people who maybe don't understand but want to. I think that if we have allies, that we show that we support and appreciate the work that the allies do for us. I think that we support and encourage each other, as women. I think that it's an important thing for us to recognize accomplishments and be there for other women, if they're scared, if they need somebody to talk to, if they accomplish something great, that we're there to cheer them on. And I think that when you're in a position where you have a platform that you can do these things, that you can make a change, that there's kind of a moral obligation to do that. That if you can make something better for people, I mean, why else are we really here?
Yeah. So we are going to wrap up now. And as promised at the beginning, we are going to show you how to get to our fundraising page. We are aiming to raise 5,000 because we need to keep our lights on. We need to pay all our bills. We need to make sure there's services available. We do, for example, daily. I don't know if you've seen this on Twitter, but every day between 8 p.m. to 12 midnight Eastern Standard Time, we tweet out helplines and contact details for domestic violence, human trafficking, rape and sexual assault, and street harassment agencies and organizations across the world, so that we can connect victims, survivors, and bystanders with people who can help. So that's just one example of the work that we do, besides Read for Pixels, where we talk to cool authors like Mary about the issues. So I'm going to put myself on screen, and we're going to talk about, hey everybody, if you joined us halfway through the session, and this is what I look like, the disembodied voice that was I'm Regina. I'm the founder and president of the Pixel Project. So I'm going to put a screen. I'm going to share something with you guys to show you the where to go. And Michelle in the chat box will also cut and paste in the link so you can just click. All right. Can you see this, Mary?
I can. Hey, okay. Look at all of us. We look pretty cool.
Yeah, we love the little collages that we do for the publicity, because it really shows how diverse the authors are who support our work. So if you want, so Mary has generously donated a few really exclusive goodies to our Read for Pixels fundraiser. And it's to say thank you to donors, who donate to help us reach the 5,000 and to keep our work running. And there's a specific, I'm just going to explain now, it's kind of like Indiegogo. There's a specific donation amount requested, a donation request attached to each item. So if you would like a certain goodie from Mary, you will have to click on it, scroll down the page, click on it, locate it, click on it, make the donation amount, and then Mary and us will make it happen. So you go to Rally App, our Rally App page at bit.ly/R4P Rally App IWD 2019. This is case sensitive. So please make sure that you type the exact URL in. And to find out more about the Read for Pixels program, go to bit.ly/Read for Pixels. Now I'm going to read out the list of what Mary has donated. She's making available a 30-minute Skype call for to chat about books, horror, writing, and more. You could be an individual writer who needs needs to ask Mary some questions about writing, or you could be a horror book club who wants to host Mary, a session with Mary, or you could be a library with a author hour and want to bring Mary in to talk about horror. Any one of those. If you belong to any one of those categories, you can click to donate to get it. And Mary's also offering a chance to become a minor character in her next book. There is a very high possibility that Mary will kill off the minor character in a very inventive way. Yes. It could be bloody. It might not be bloody. You could be sucked into another dimension. We don't know. As we see from behind the door, there are many ways for people to go bye-bye.
Oh, yes.
And if you're an author, Mary also offers a written critique. Is also offering a written critique to authors. Let's say you need a pair of fresh eyes, and you need someone apart from your beta readers or your writing group to have a look at it, or the writing forums that you're in. Mary's happy to do that. Just send her 1,000 words from your work in progress. Make the donation, and Mary will do that, and she'll send you a written critique via email. We'll connect you with Mary once the donation is done. And there are plenty, if you're not up for any of that, there are plenty more author goodies from authors including Joe Walton, Victoria Dow, Fran Wild, and more. And new goodies will be released every week throughout March. So you check back, if you bookmark the page and check back every Friday, there are going to be new goodies up because we're going to have new authors having their hangouts every week. So next week, for example, we're going to have Alma Alexander, S.A. Chakraborty, and Caroline Kepnes, who's a hit television program. You is based on her book You, and it's about, you can see that, and you'll be able to see the psyche of a male stalker. So, and to find out more about violence against women, what you can do about it, if you're a bystander or you know someone who is facing it, whether it is domestic violence, rape, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, child marriage, any of those, go to the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net to learn more about it and what you can do about it. If you cannot find the information there, you may email us at info@thepixelproject.net, and we will connect you to an expert who can help, because there are plenty of agencies and organizations out there who can do that. And all the funds raised, every dollar raised will review one pixel from our Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Review campaign. So you can please visit review.thepixelproject.net to learn more about it. And we are highlighting, and we're going to be revealing a Nobel Peace Prize winner who has a long history of helping to stop violence against women. And I am going to stop the presentation now and put Mary back on screen so that we can say bye. But Mary, do you have any announcements? You got a new book coming out soon, right?
I do. I have another Kathy Ryan book coming out called Inside the Asylum, and that I believe is coming out toward the end of April. And then another Kathy Ryan book coming out probably in September, although I can't say for sure, which is called Beyond the Gate. And I think that, you know, people who liked Kathy Ryan books they're going to be into these too. They were a lot of fun. I have a novella called The Skin We're In coming out, I think sometime probably toward the end of this year, beginning of next year. I'm not really sure yet. I have a weekly podcast if you're interested in cosmic horror, or, you know, the sort of the psychological, weird, surreal kind of horror. I review things that are not quite Lovecraft, but yeah, are in that Lovecraftian tradition. Sometimes, you know, we touch on Lovecraft, but mostly it's everybody else doing cosmic horror in books, movies, television, music, video games, tabletop role-playing games, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I do that. I co-host on the Horror Show with Brian Keene every week, and Yeah, I mean, I have a few short stories coming out this year, and I'm just chugging away at some new novels, and it's I think it's gonna be a good year. So if you go to www.marysangiovanni.com, all the places I'm going to be, I update that with all the appearances I'm going to be making, when new books are coming out, all that kind of good stuff. And there's links to my Patreon if you want to support the Patreon. There's links to pretty much everything that's available by me somewhere somehow, including the podcast. So and also, if you are if you're getting your credit cards out to buy anything anyway, please donate to the Pixel Project. It really is. It's a wonderful cause, and you'll be doing a lot of good for people. And just please consider, whatever you can give.
Yeah. And so now we're going to say bye to everybody. So have a good day or have a good night wherever you are in the world. So Marianne has to say bye now.
Bye. And thank you for having me, and thank you everybody who submitted a question and listen to the session. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye.